Welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm jaymewoj, and today we're discussing the fight for LGBTQ equality. Would you each like to introduce yourselves really quickly? I don't care who goes first. Jump on in.
I'll go. My name is Drian Juarez. I am a film and television producer. I've been a grassroots progressive activist for several years. I'm not good at math. And I tend to favor my own opinions.
As most people do.
Go ahead. Hi everyone, my name is Drian Juarez, and I'm a program manager here at the LA LGBT Center. I manage the Transgender Economic Empowerment Project in our legal services department. So we help trans people find good jobs, transition on the job, or advocate for their rights on the job. We also train employers on transcultural competency in the workplace.
Cool. My name's Casper Perdola, and I am a musician in a band, and I also am a web developer, and not quite as awesome as these people, not very proactive, but trying to be more proactive, honestly. So, yeah.
Everything your hair is very proactive. I love your hair. I'm kind of jealous.
So the first thing I want to discuss, so I was asking people on Twitter what they thought the most important things for us to discuss were. And overwhelmingly, people said they would like to hear our thoughts on inclusion within the LGBTQ movement. And I think we're in a shift, because when it was mostly focused on gay marriage, or marriage equality, it was very much white gay men, and sometimes white gay women who were kind of put in the forefront, and then everyone else kind of seemed to take a back seat to that kind of fight. And now with the bathroom bills and everything that is happening, I think it's becoming a little bit more inclusive, but I think there's still a big place for us to go. So thoughts on how we become more inclusive within the movement?
You know, one mantra that I'm constantly reiterating for people is check your privilege. We all have privilege. And I think when we have privilege, it's easy to not recognize it and not recognize how the privilege I have, because I have a computer, I have a car, I have an apartment, how, you know, that blinds me to some of the difficulties that our community members face. Some community members don't have a roof over their head, can't get to a computer, and so can't be connected in the ways that I can. And so recognizing that when we're talking about privilege, it can be the basics, the privilege of, you know, having internet. And so I think that when we realize that not everyone has the same privileges as others, then we start creating spaces where we are aware of those things, where we start looking at the ways that we can include people who maybe don't have transportation, internet access, what have you. We start looking at the ways that we integrate those community members into all the work that we do. And so for me, it's always about checking your privilege. I think that's a good start.
Awesome.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And as you say that, what makes me think of is, you know, one of the things I do on the side is leadership and personal development training. And a lot of the people that I deal with are people who don't seem to realize that they come from a victim mentality already. And I think that's kind of, I know it's a truism for Americans. I don't know how pervasive it is elsewhere in the world, but we as human beings tend to think of ourselves as somebody who are on the receiving end of something bad in general. We notice that first. You know, we can remember the times we got a parking ticket. You know, we might not be able to remember the times that we did something positive for somebody else, you know? So it's a knee-jerk reaction built into us culturally somehow that we are on the receiving end of things. We're victims. So immediately we come from this victim place. On top of that, we all have, as LGBTQ people, some level of work we always still get to do in self-acceptance. It's not like for the vast majority of us, we were born into a world where acceptance was a thing for us. So if we already feel like victims and we're already always working on being more accepting of ourselves, I think it's not a surprise that we within the LGBTQ community tend to struggle to accept other people in our community who are not like us. I think a lot of, I know for a fact, a great majority of the gay white men I know think of themselves as a little bit more normal than everybody else in the LGBTQ community. And I think being able to pass as straight makes that even more complicated. And I you know, then we throw around insults at each other that are jokes. We call people tranny and stuff like that in a joking sense, but really what's underneath that is people who are gay, who don't identify as transgender, look down on transgender people. It's a thing. It cascades up and down. And, it's a thing that I think we need to work on. And I'm not sure what that takes. I'm not sure how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of what the clear-cut solution is, but it seems like there is a certain level of privilege, as you were saying. Before, when I would identify as like lesbian or gay, before I kind of was like, okay, no, actually, I'm not this, I'm trans. It seemed as though I was still like a second-class citizen compared to the white gay male, which is already weird to think of. And then on top of that, being trans, now it's like you're at the bottom of the totem pole. And I think people are so absorbed in like as you're saying, their own struggle with like trying to like propel their rights in this region, or also trying to come to self-acceptance, that they also are really like equally like they equally fall into like kind of the other and just like pushing the other to the side, and not really coming to like a really deep understanding of like stuff that is really just permeating across the whole spectrum. And so I think it's important that you just like, you check your privilege and you realize like, okay, I have a struggle and my struggle is real. Someone else has a struggle and it's just as real, but I don't really understand it because it's not my struggle. But our struggles are all equally valid, and in some ways, maybe more valid because I can assimilate, into this whatever normal society in the gender binary that exists or whatever. A lot of people can't have that luxury, but the people that do can kind of like move through society more fluidly. So I think it starts with internally trying to break these barriers and divisions, and then from there we can actually cascade into society.
Yeah,
I really like that idea of check your privilege, and it makes me think of how if everybody who had an opinion first took a step back and looked at it objectively and was like, are there other valid points of view here? Imagine if we also did things like every time we think about our place in the world and the struggles of others, we first went, let me check my privilege real quick. Is it possible that I don't see that I have privilege in this way that I didn't realize? And I need to be aware of that. And I need to be sensitive to that with other people.
Which is the whole point of why I decided to do this show, is to bring kind of mindfulness into the political and social movements, and kind of make them much less partisan, because people just get so stuck in their opinion and they don't see anything else as valid. But it's mostly because they're not actually communicating, sitting down with people who may think differently or think the same but have different nuances within that thought. And as soon as they sit down with people and have a very deep conversation, they realize that it's not as simple as they made it. And on the whole privilege thing, I think it's interesting because I guess how do you then, this was another question that I got quite often on Twitter, how do we keep the most privileged within the community active in fighting for those who have less privilege? Because what it is showing is when you see the media and things, kind of the white gay couple is becoming kind of very normalized within the media and within our culture. And as it gets more normalized, the privilege becomes more and more on level with straight white couples. So keeping them engaged to fight for those that we still need to lift up as they're lifted up, if that makes sense.
You know, speaking as a white male, one of the things that I notice most often is how easy it feels on a visceral level for other people to make me wrong for having an opinion about something that concerning people that are perceived to have more of a challenge in society than I do. And I'm not saying they don't, but I have been verbally attacked numerous times for beginning a sentence that sounded like I had an opinion about a thing that pertained to a group of people who traditionally or typically have more of a disadvantage than I do. And I think that pushes a lot of people away. I think we throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it can be infuriating to hear someone say something ignorant that they didn't even realize was ignorant. But when we're interrupting people when they speak, and when we are being angry and vicious with people, it's not a way to win hearts and minds. And I'm not saying that what people say isn't wrong. But, you know, I've experienced this too, and feeling really powerfully in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. I've had Black people say to me really nasty things because they didn't feel like I was being sensitive enough to the experience of African-American people. And what I was trying to do, perhaps in ignorance, was support the Black Lives Matter movement. And then I thought, well, you know, maybe there's just no winning for me, and I need to step out of this because I don't have the right to even talk about this as a white man. So, you know, I guess I'll take my support for Black Lives Matter to the ballot box and leave it at that, if that makes sense.
And, you know, for me, when I always think about people with privilege, I often think that, you know, a good place for them to be is to open doors, because they are accepted in spaces and have the luxury of being included in spaces. I think it's really important for them to speak up then and say, why don't we have more people of color here? Why don't we have, you know, more trans people here? I think that it's really important for those people who have privilege to open that door and start that conversation if it's not happening already. I think the way that I've seen people who are perceived as having privilege be shut down is when they are perceived as talking for a group. Like, I, as the white person, I'm going to tell you, you know, what people of color go through or what trans people go through, instead of I, as a person of privilege, I'm going to open the doors so that this person can tell you themselves what they're going through, what their needs are. And so I think it's being just aware of that, that as somebody with privilege, that you should be opening doors for others and creating those diverse environments, and B, making sure that you're not speaking for people, but rather creating a space for people to be included.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's important not to speak for people as well. But I guess there's some areas where it's kind of impossible to get around, right? Like in media. So if you're writing a movie or you're writing an article or something, you don't have the luxury of being like, here's so-and-so and this is them. I mean, unless you completely literally quote them. But so I think it's important for spaces in the media where if they are going to act as the voice of someone or try to open doors in this way, that they do really make sure that they, you know, do some research and talk to people and really understand what they're trying to convey and try and stay away from like typical stereotypes and perpetuating stuff that already exists.
Yeah.
Because in media, that's one of the focal points that really changes or continues to let society be within whatever, you know, context it's creating. And so in a normal setting, yeah, it's important to bring people in and be like, here, this is their voice, listen to them. But when we don't have that luxury, I think it's important to, at least if you're going to try to speak on behalf of someone or create some sort of like character or whatever, that you make sure you're really trying to make it as in line with a normal voice as possible.
And if I can just respond to that, I think that's a really interesting point, the whole concept of creating opportunities for people to speak for themselves. And it makes me think of, recently I was in a room with several people, and everyone in the room was white. And we were talking about how important it was to us to support the Black Lives Matter movement, and we weren't sure how to do it without doing it wrong. And I, as you say, open a door for people to speak for themselves. I can't imagine practically I could call up an African American friend and say, hey, I'm with a whole bunch of white people. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. Could you come over here and talk to us about it from the perspective of somebody who has firsthand experience? I think there's got to be a way to yes and what people of privilege are trying to do with well intention, as opposed to a no, stop, you're wrong, here, do this, is because I think if we can make people feel good for wanting to try, and then say, but also, can we tweak it like this? And also, can we redirect in this direction, or can we build on that by this? I just think it wins over more people who are in a position to make a difference. And I think it creates more confidence in people. I would be afraid, honestly, if I was a white Republican in a room full of white Republicans, to say, hey, all these white Republicans, I know that we're not necessarily comfortable around Black people, but why don't I bring one in and talk about race? I might be afraid to do that if I didn't feel really empowered. And I think we can empower people in a room where they can bring someone in by building them up with their desire to try, and go from there. But that's just my rambling 2 cents.
Yeah, I think it's very twofold. I was actually at a Black Lives Matter protest 2 weeks ago in LA, and it was very interesting because it was the first one I was at where the majority of the people there, a slight majority, were white. And it kind of started with everyone in a circle, and people would go in the middle and just give their experiences and talk. And it was very interesting because whenever someone of color would make a generalization about white people, there would always be at least one white person to protest what they were saying. And it always came from, instead of saying, well, this isn't about me, and they're not actually talking about all white people, they're making a generalization, that person felt personally offended and needed to speak out. And I think the problem on both sides is often that we lead with ego and not understanding. And it's, if you're actually if you're in the cause, if you're in the LGBT community, you're talking with someone who's straight, who's not, and they're not understanding, you have to do your best to not lead with your own ego and listen to what they're feeling and try to engage. But it's the other way around as well. You can't let your ego as a straight person detach you from what the other person is trying to say. And I think that's where the balance is. And I think there's also this other thing of discomfort. We live in a culture where as soon as people feel uncomfortable, they like to run away from the situation. And discomfort's not always bad, especially when you're dealing with people who don't understand and are very passionate about certain things. That discomfort can actually be the thing that leads to an opening and the understanding.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
I love that. I love that concept, discomfort leading to something positive. How cool.
Yeah, and you have to, I think there's a balance too between, is it just discomfort, or is this an unsafe situation, or is this a dangerous situation that we're getting in? There's always that kind of that median that you have to deal with. But yes, I feel too many people just run away, because even when I was in that situation, and I've been in marriage equality protests that are very similar, where people are engaging, and it's when someone disagrees and another person comes in with compassion and understanding and tries to explain it, that the breakthroughs are there. It's when people just come in with their egos and just attack, that everyone just kind of scurries, and it's like, okay, now we're not talking about this, let's move on, and then nothing gets done.
That's fantastic. Jamie for the win. Drop the mic.
So, the other question I was getting was about how to reach out to children and just people when they're younger, to get them, I don't want to say accustomed, but aware of the struggle, or educate them on the history of the LGBT movement at an earlier age. And California is just the first state that passed that, I think starting in second grade. Students are going to be taught LGBT history as well as disabled history, and it's much more inclusive. And the interesting thing is in California, we haven't really seen a backlash on it, I don't feel. A little bit, but nothing extreme. Do you think that's kind of one of the next battles that we're going to take through 50 states, or just opinions on that in general?
Well, I think it's a great thing because I grew up not knowing that LGBT people existed, much less transgender people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did start learning about trans people, it was through Maury Povich and Jerry Springer and just really, sensationalized characterizations of trans people. And so I think that's important. I think the follow-up to that is, the teachers themselves. I think in more progressive cities like Los Angeles, having a teacher who will teach that subject matter in a way that is respectful, there's a higher likelihood of that. Mm-hmm. But in more conservative areas, I would be afraid of what tone a particular teacher puts on that information and whether they, make it sound like something, questionable or, just not teaching it on the same level that they would other history. And so for me, I think that's, sort of the next question mark. What are the parameters on how this will be taught? And how do you ensure that teachers will be doing it justice and not, a disservice? And so, I think definitely as we start going through more conservative states, it's definitely going to be part of the fight. But luckily in cities like Los Angeles and the more progressive states, that hopefully will be less of a battle.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to jump in, that kind of the exact same thing. Like when I was growing up, even though I grew up in California, I was in a rather more like conservative Republican area and come from a very conservative family and everything. And so I really didn't even have any sort of idea of what LGBT, let alone Q, was. I didn't even really understand that I personally was trans until I literally like college, when I took these, feminist theory classes. And I'm like, oh, whoa, there's a word for that. Like, I'm not just absolutely weird. And so like, I think it's, even though there's always the risk of, someone kind of misconstruing the information or whatever, at least if it's being put out there, it's better than nothing. Because kids at the same time, though they kind of get fed by their parents and stuff, a lot of kids are intelligent enough to kind of come to their own decisions. Even if they don't agree with their parents, they just kind of keep their decisions or their ideas to themselves, unless they're really rebellious. But I think on top of the schooling thing too, it's just a very large spectrum where there are a lot of different avenues where you need to create awareness at a young age. Like, for me personally, like when I talk to kids, like when I'm in a band, it's literally in like the, direct message in Instagram and stuff like that. And I hear their stories and things like that. And I think it's just important for these younger people to have outlets to talk to people, whether it's in a very private manner or if they see very public figures that they can relate to. And they're like, wow, that person's like me, that's a Black trans guy, or, that's a whatever, an Asian lesbian or something. And they can really be like, okay, like, well, that's someone that's like leading a productive life and they seem happy and cool and positive, and they're not, like made to seem like they're crazy or just sick or whatever. And so I think having public figures that are positive, as well as, creating awareness at a very young age, I think is like kind of the best direction. I'm sure there are a lot of other minute avenues too, but I think those two are like really key sides to the coin.
I think we can also learn a lot about this from the way that sex ed is taught across the country. Even in California, schools have the right to not give comprehensive sex education to their students. And it makes me think of when I was in high school, my high school boyfriend went to a different high school, and he told me a story about how sex ed was taught by one of the gym teachers, and he read from the textbook about how HIV is transmitted, and then he stopped and he said, but we all know that HIV is really spread by putting a penis in something, so the only people who can get it are gay men. And which obviously is wrong, and obviously put all the women in that room at risk because they had incorrect information about how they could possibly contract a potentially lethal STD. Mm-hmm. But that didn't go punished. That was a known thing that happened, and the administration at that school looked the other way. It's scary, you know, when a big state like California makes a decision like this about what the educational requirements are. Awesome, because smaller states buy textbooks from the same companies that make the textbooks for the big states, and they save money by buying books that meet California standards. But at the same time, when Texas decides to take the entire Black history piece of American history out, diminishing Martin Luther King Jr. and slavery to a couple of pages, other small states end up buying textbooks that do the same thing. So we have, in a way, two Americas, people who are educated with real current information about history, real current information about STDs, real current information about how the world works and what actually happened before today. And one of the things that concerns me is that we're raising generations of people who really genuinely believe different things are the absolute truths about how the world works and what has happened. And I'm not sure that we can do anything about that unless we have national education standards that that no one can opt out of. But I don't know that Republicans in Congress would let us do that either.
Yeah, I think the success for me, beyond with the struggles of the education, I think especially for marriage equality, was the push for people to come out and talk to their straight family and friends about their lives and who they were, and kind of making it so that you couldn't ignore it. And specifically talking about the trans community, because it is a smaller community. How do you feel we go about also doing that? Because I feel like that is the most successful way to push for the rights and equality, is if we have as many people who are not trans or part of the LGBTQ community understanding what's going on. But it's harder when you're in a smaller community, because then you obviously can't reach out to everybody.
And, you know, I think that when you look at the sort of arc of the trans community, a lot of the ways that people have learned about us and the way that we've even learned about each other has been through social media. Mm-hmm. It's been through YouTube transition videos for trans men and trans women. It's, you know, those video diaries that people put up talking about everything from discrimination to love to everything. And so I think social media has sort of taken the place of formal education in educating people about trans experience in particular and trans history. You know, I think that many of our kids are learning that there's a, you know, history to being trans that's global, mm-hmm. and, you know, that has had many different names and definitions. But that experience has been, you know, something that has been constant and has been throughout history. And so I think that social media, you know, is doing a lot for what formal education is not doing in terms of identity and teaching us about our own history. I think that especially when you're looking at genderqueer communities, which is really sort of the newest wave to our evolution, youth, Generation Z, people 13 to 20 years old, are coming to their parents and they're coming out as heteroflexible, as, you know, all these new terms that they know that they can define for their family. And so they're coming from a very empowered place, but they've done the work of educating themselves. It wasn't something that came from their schools. And so I think that, you know, our community is learning to educate itself through, you know, the media resources that we have.
Do you feel,
yeah,
I just want to ask about the I guess the labels. Do you feel that having a label to identify with makes it easier, or do you think it makes it harder, if that makes sense?
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, I do gender and sexual diversity trainings, and some of the, you know, criticism I hear is, oh my God, why are there so many labels and so many, new words? Well, the reality is that our language continues to expand. We are always learning new words. It's about the bias that we have for what we're learning and feeling like, why am I being forced to learn something new when we do it pretty much effortlessly for everything else? And so I think it's also checking our biases. And I think that, yes, one day we may have the alphabet soup in terms of LGBTQIIAO, and it can keep going. And that's okay. I think when it comes down to it, it's not about getting hung up on the pronoun, the name, the title, but rather to respect what people are telling you. Respect my pronoun, respect my identity, even if you don't understand it. That's okay. You don't have to understand me to respect me.
Yeah. No, that's sorry. I don't even know if I can add much more of that. That's pretty spot on.
Second mic drop of the night.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'd actually like,
you can't
oh, go ahead.
People. No, I was just say there's like, most of the time you're not gonna be able to convince people to understand. And it's like at the end of the day, it just comes down to like, okay, well, if you can just abstain at that point, but just treat me as a human and treat me as how I would like to be treated, just as I would treat you, or I would hope, right? Or you would hope.
Well, and I think it takes, go ahead.
Oh, it just makes me think about how sometimes I know someone is transitioning and not necessarily physically, although that obviously happens, but people who are, I have a friend who I met as Rose and became Roman, and that space where Rose was transitioning socially into Roman it didn't happen one day she became he. And so I checked in a few times and said, would you rather I introduce you as she or he, or speak of you in terms of feminine or masculine pronoun, or whatever. And it was one of the things that was really great about it was that we could laugh about how silly it was that I was afraid to say the wrong thing. And I felt like it was disarming for a lot of people because many of our mutual friends, she was the first person that they ever knew that they knew of that was in the process of transitioning, and being able to laugh about it. Aren't we humans cute that we don't always say the right thing? Really made it easier for people who were uncomfortable at first to digest and begin to understand.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of pointed at, a lot of times we expect that if we explain something to someone who doesn't agree with us, that they should just automatically understand. Where, I mean, even myself, if I'm challenged, there's a period of time it takes me before I come around to that idea, or I let the evidence sway me a different way. And I think that's very much what happens in social movements as well. As you may come out one day or tell someone you're transitioning or whatever it is, and they may react badly, but over time, most of the time they'll get comfortable with it if they see things in there that they can relate to and humanize them, as opposed to if you're constantly going after them with attacks and you don't understand me and kind of this aggressive approach. A lot of times people turn off. So I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well. I'd like to actually move on to the RNC, because I had a really interesting experience watching it, because I feel like ever since marriage equality happened, there's 100% this push for all these discrimination laws and everything. But now since Orlando, there seems to be this rhetoric where they at least feel like they have to be inclusive in the way they're talking about the LGBTQ community. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. Is that just a step in the right direction, or is that just a cover? What do you think that is exactly?
Can you give me a context? Because I feel like I've also seen plenty of instances where, I mean, they're not adopting.
Yeah, there was just, I think for the first time, there was a lot of anti-LGBT rhetoric, but for the first time, there were multiple people who would include the LGBT community and the people they have to protect and that they're fighting for. And it was just this weird. I think Ted Cruz had it. There were a few others that mentioned it too, and it just stuck out to me as this was the very first time that that's happening, and I didn't know if that was them giving up on the situation, or if it was a sign that the GOP is slowly coming around to it, or what exactly it was. So I was just curious on your opinions. It's hard because I don't even know. I'm just.
I mean, I didn't like tune into the whole thing. I caught bits and pieces on the radio, but I would say as a whole, I would just take it at face value as a whole lot of nothing until there are actual like documented actions over time that's proving that they do have some sort of like shift in their mentality, and you know they're deciding to sway this way. But I think right now it's just a ploy to get more people on
I think the thing that actually stuck out to me was not the rhetoric, but the fact that the few people who said it, the audience actually cheered. I didn't hear any booing. So I was like, I just didn't, it was so weird to me. I didn't know how to react to it.
I think a lot of people in the Republican Party, especially Donald Trump, think, perhaps erroneously, I think erroneously, but they think that they are allies to the LGBT community. They think that their policies are good for us, because they really believe that saying things like, well, the LGBTQ community needs our military to be as strong as possible and needs ISIS to be afraid of us so that they can live to continue to be LGBTQ. And while that is technically true, you know, it's not the same. It's kind of like when Michelle Bachmann, before marriage equality happened nationwide, said, well, gay people can get married. They can marry someone of the opposite sex. It's not the same, but it feels to them like it's the same. And I think that we have to embrace their attempt, because I think that at least for some of them, the desire to be inclusive is genuine. But I think we also have to hold firm on civil unions are not the same thing. You know, giving businesses the right to refuse service to LGBTQ people is not the same thing. But I think, you know, it is heartening to me that a major party's nominee acknowledged that he was glad to hear Republican Party cheer for protecting LGBT people. But obviously there's a lot more to go. They didn't have a trans person speaking at their convention, for instance.
No. Yes.
And, you know, I think that for me, it really just sounds like lip service until, you know, they have, you know, some proven record of trying to improve LGBTQ communities' lives. You know, it's just words. And I think about, you know, this national platform where they're trying to influence as many people as possible. So they're going to say whatever. But the reality is that the way they are voting and the laws that they are supporting are very anti-LGBT. And I think oftentimes when they're talking about LGBT, they mean white, lesbian, gay. They have no recognition of trans or people of color or queer people of color or any of that. So for them, I think that when they're talking about LGBTQ, what they're really saying is white, lesbian, and gay, like the individual who spoke at the Republican National Convention. Is it getting better for Republicans who are white and gay and lesbian? Maybe, but is it getting better for someone like me or a trans immigrant or a queer person of color? Not really.
Yeah. I'd also like to talk about how we challenge, moving forward, how we challenge the media, because one of the big things that I noticed with Orlando was that in the major media, almost all the images I was seeing was of white gays and lesbians. And then when I would go on social media, I would see images taken by people who were actually there, and it just showed the full range of the LGBTQ community. And even in the coverage, it was very much slanted to kind of what you're talking about, this. Just we're going to go to what's the most normal aspect of it. Okay, let's talk about white gay and lesbians and kind of ignore everything else. So how do we challenge the media?
You know, I thought that Melissa Harris Perry was doing a great job.
Yes, she was.
Bringing voices to that platform that were never given that space. But I think the uphill battle with that is that we have a handful of people who own media, you know, and a handful of cis, generally hetero men who own media. And so they get to shape what we get to see and what we don't get to see. And so when Melissa Harris Perry really brought real conversations onto network television, they shut her down.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also about recognizing who is in control of media and challenging them directly. It's great to say we need more diversity programming or what have you, but the people at the top, they get to tell their producers, directors, what have you, how they want things to look. And so they are the ones who I think we should be targeting and saying, we see you, we know you, and we're challenging you to do better.
I completely agree with that. And I would also say, as somebody who used to be a publicist and as somebody who works in film and television today, there are two things that don't happen enough that need to happen. Well, three. First of all, we need to have more really, really skilled LGBTQ pundits of color, people who are available to the media and actively promoting themselves as people who can speak on behalf of a community or about a topic, which is a thing that white people do very well. White straight people in particular, white straight men especially, are great at promoting themselves, saying, hey, you need someone to talk about these topics, I'm your go-to guy. And they push themselves. A lot of these people have agents. So we need to supply them with people, but then we also need to create a demand for those people. So we need to, you know, honestly, Rachel Maddow is the leading anchor on MSNBC, not for, I mean, she's talented and great at what she does, but what really matters is that she built an audience and built a demand for what she has to offer before MSNBC ever hired her. And then it was a part-time thing, not the main event at all. So we need to come at it from all angles. We need to start providing talent to make it effortless for them, but then we also need to start creating a demand for them so that it makes dollars and cents for them to be focusing on issues that matter to us and talking to people that look and act and talk like us as well. And I think, you know, when I used to be in PR, one of the things we talked about was there are some publicists who are bullies, and they'll call a news outlet after they cover something that didn't include their client and say, why the hell didn't you include my client on this topic? And they did it consistently, and it got them coverage the next time. So we do need to consistently say, you just talked about what happened in Orlando. All you did was show white people talking about the white people affected by this. We need you to talk to and about the people of color, the trans people, and on and on and on. This needs to be done consistently. And until we're doing it consistently, we can't expect for there to be a lot of traction, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's really funny that you said that, because I was floating through my head. I was like, well, if it made monetary sense, then sure, people would be all over it. And so it's just like one of those things where I think it starts in social media, like you're saying, and this discourse happens in these kind of like superstars or rock stars of their community that build a following not only in the community, but outside of it, because they're like, okay, well, there's this person with the message and I kind of understand it and I'm kind of interested and this is different and whatever. And if that gets built, then over time, it will make sense for kind of the top to be like, wait a second, I can monetize this. It's not really ideal. That's not the ideal situation, but if that's the only way you can kind of manipulate the situation, that's what you have to work with.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that every executive in television, in the news media period, in any media period, is one bad slump of ratings or eyeballs or whatever away from losing their job. It doesn't take much. And so, you know, they're incentivized to act based on fear. I got to do the safest stuff possible, the stuff that I can bet on works. So there isn't an incentive built into the system for them to diversify, literally or figuratively, and we've got to create that incentive for them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because on a lot of the panels I do, this comes up, is the generation divide and where people get their information. And it's the younger generation tends to almost solely go to new media sources, where the older generation goes to the network news. And it's interesting to me because you talk about challenging them, and I'm like, I don't know if I think that will happen, because I feel like the movement of people who want to diversify it are focused on something else. So it almost seems like the bottom line will only happen is when the older generations die out and they realize, oh, no one's watching me anymore, then we'll adapt. So it may just
I think that's already happening.
Yeah.
I think that's already happening. News, TV ratings in general are going down, where eyeballs on the internet are going up. Mm-hmm. And the show My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend on the CW, I think, started with the YouTube series, and the girl who's the star in it literally only was ever on network television once before that. So, but she had a big following on the internet, and now she's a Golden Globe and I think also Peabody Award winning or Critics' Choice Award winning star of a show. And I think that's a pretty legitimate way. I have a lot of actor friends who are trying to find their way into building a national platform the same way. So I think we can start there. I think if we as the LGBTQ community started to rally around the people that we consider our thought leaders and make sure that they have a viable, provable platform, then it makes it a lot easier to take them to, CNN or MSNBC or even Fox and say, this is somebody who gets eyeballs. You need to talk to them and you need to feature them. And you need to talk about the things that are important to them.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end for the evening. I just want to thank you all. Did anyone want to leave any parting words of wisdom? I always leave it open.
For me, I think the thing that I'm always reiterating is that the future is fluid. The future is about identities that aren't black and white, that there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to human identity, human beings, period. So keep an open mind, learn, and diversify your circle of friends. It's what will enrich your life and make it so much better.
Yeah. Love that. Anyone else?
I don't want to screw that up. That was great. Third mic.
Awesome.
Thank
you. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful night. Bye.
You too. Bye.